Good afternoon, and welcome to our webinar presented in partnership with the University of Michigan School for Environment and Sustainability. My name is Liz Kirkwood, and I'm the Executive Director of Flow Water Advocates. We are a Great Lakes Water Law Policy Center based in Traverse City. Michigan's groundwater is often referred to as the sixth Great Lake because its volume is roughly equivalent to that of Lake Huron. Despite that, groundwater remains underappreciated, understudied, and underprotected in Michigan and across the watershed. For the past 16 months, Flow has had the great honor and privilege to partner with the University of Michigan SEAS program to undertake this initiative and to propose an integrated groundwater strategy for the state of Michigan and outline a concrete plan of action that includes regulatory, statutory, and institutional structural recommendations. This new report, titled A Groundwater Strategy for Michigan Protecting the Sixth Great Lake, assesses Michigan's current groundwater management landscape, identifies areas for improvement, and proposes recommendation for the state legislature, regulatory agencies, and advocacy organizations to advance groundwater protection. The Great Lakes state can and should be a leader in protecting the sixth Great Lake. This report provides a roadmap for groundwater protection that would put Michigan into this leading role. Toward the end of our hour here today, we'll answer audience questions. You can submit a question at any time using the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Before I turn it over to our moderator and senior advisor, Skip Press, I'd like to share a land and water acknowledgement. Flow Water Advocates is located on lands historically occupied by the Three Fires Confederacy, the Anishinaabe, Odawa, Ojibwe, and Potawatomi nations. We are grateful to these sovereign nations for sustaining their sacred waters and are humbled to be a partner in protecting the Great Lakes watershed for future generations. Now I'll turn it over to Skip and our panel. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, Liz, and welcome everyone. Thank you for spending this lunch hour with us on this webinar. I hope you find it interesting and illuminating. So to start, and I think everyone appreciates this, we are water rich in Michigan. We sit at the heart of the largest, most extraordinary fresh surface water system in the world. We have over 11,000 inland lakes and countless streams and rivers. Yet, perhaps because of our water wealth, we don't think about groundwater that much. But groundwater is out of sight and it's out of mind. Yet, we as a state are remarkably reliant on groundwater for industrial uses, agricultural uses, and household uses. In fact, Michigan has more household wells than any other state in the country at 1.2 plus million wells. They serve 25% of Michigan's population. And that dependence on groundwater suggests a number of critical questions. Are we, in fact, good stewards of this resource that we're so dependent on? What are the emerging issues relating to groundwater use and groundwater protection? How does Michigan compare to other states in terms of our understanding and our protection of groundwater? To answer these critical questions and many others, we were fortunate to be able to work with these four outstanding graduate students from the University of Michigan who are charged with studying and evaluating Michigan's groundwater programs to assess where we are in terms of understanding this resource and how we might improve our care and oversight of groundwater in Michigan. Our four students are Emma Welsh, Kelly Campagna, Paige Lund, and Lillian Wegge. Let me remind everyone that during this presentation, any questions that you have, you can submit, and we will do our best to attempt to answer your questions following the student presentations. Emma, would you like to introduce yourself?
Thank you, Skip. Hi, my name is Emma. I'm originally from Fremont, Michigan, and at the University of Michigan, I'm studying aquatic sciences and environmental engineering.
My name is Kelsey Campana. I'm a student at the School of Environment Sustainability, focusing on ecosystem science and management and environmental policy and planning. And I'm originally from Highland, Michigan.
Hi, my name is Paige Lund. I'm originally from California. I'm a second year master's student at University of Michigan with a specialization in geospatial data science and environmental policy and planning.
And lastly, my name is Lillian Wegge. I'm a second year at University of Michigan studying environmental justice in seas, and I'm also getting a master's in urban and regional planning. So I will graduate in the spring of 27. I'm now going to share my screen and we'll hand it back to Emma to start our presentation of our work.
We're going to just quickly go over our motivations for the report, give a little bit of an overview on Michigan's groundwater, get into our 3 case studies in Antrim, Ottawa, and Washtenaw counties, do a little bit of policy analysis on Michigan groundwater policies and how they compare to other states, and then finally wrap up giving some recommendations as to what we can do with Michigan groundwater. Perfect. So sort of a skip here. I was motivated by increasing attention to Michigan's groundwater resources and protecting them. While groundwater supplies the majority of usable freshwater globally, Michigan, despite its historically abundant water, faces growing pressures from agricultural irrigation, increasing consumptive use, population change, as well as the expansion of water-intensive industries. Moreover, contamination identified over the last several decades has raised ongoing concerns about groundwater quality in several sites. Also, this report was motivated by Flo's work, which suggests that groundwater protection in Michigan is fragmented and that there is a need for a cohesive, sustainable management approach. So next, I'll give a bit of an overview on Michigan's groundwater resources. Michigan has unique water in the entire Great Lakes Basin. Around 1,000 cubic miles of groundwater is about 70% of Michigan's wells actually pulled from shallow global aquifers, showing some of those major bedrock formations of the Central Peninsula. Streams and surface waters are sustained by groundwater inputs, especially cold water streams that are important for fisheries like trout fisheries. There has been some new attention to Michigan groundwater, and there's several ongoing efforts by Michigan's Department of Energy, Great Lakes and Environment, and other partners that are helping to improve our understanding of groundwater in Michigan. Some examples include the Groundwater Database Management System, which will centralize the state's groundwater data, the Hydrologic Enhanced Permission, which will expand Michigan's monitoring well network, gauge network, as well as creating a regional flow model in Southwest Michigan. Michigan Geological Survey also completes detailed aquifer mapping and is currently doing a regional water resources study in Western Michigan counties. And the Michigan Hydrologic Framework is a project set to sort of centralize a place where we can share water model for the state. So in Michigan, groundwater use is assessed by looking at large quantity withdrawals, which are set to withdraw 100,000 gallons per day. And these are assessed with a screening tool called the WAT, which looks at how these large quantity withdrawals would impact nearby streams and fish populations. So from 2014 to 2023, median total groundwater use in Michigan was about 219 billion gallons per year. Here we have a figure showing groundwater use by sector in those years. And the largest user was irrigation, public water supply. Also have a lot of household wells throughout Michigan. There are over 1 million wells that withdraw an estimated 230 million gallons of groundwater per day. There are 2.6 million citizens, which is about a quarter of the state's population, that are served by these wells. And we have a map here of household wells per 1,000 residents. And as you can see, the northern lower peninsula of the state has the highest well density. There are also several sources of contamination to Michigan's groundwater from both human and natural sources. Some common contaminants are nitrates, PFAS, volatile organic compounds, and coliform bacteria, and arsenic, uranium, and manganese are naturally occurring contaminants in some areas of the state. Data for many of these contaminants is unavailable. Next, we're going to discuss our case studies in Antrim, Ottawa, and Washtenaw counties, which will give some specific examples of contamination, along with some quantity-related issues.
Awesome. Thank you, Emma. Okay, so for the case studies, they aimed to serve three key purposes in our analysis. First, they show both strengths and gaps in Michigan's groundwater management framework. Second, they help connect our broader policy evaluation to real-world situations. And finally, they bring in lived experiences to inform our policy recommendations. For each case study, we conducted 5 to 10 interviews with local officials such as township supervisors and municipal water professionals, state officials, and impacted individuals, which we define as residents affected by but not involved in decision making. The Antrim County case study focuses on 2 orphaned contamination sites resulting from industrial pollution. The term orphaned refers to a contaminated site where the party responsible no longer exists, cannot be identified, or is insolvent. So first we'll look at the Tar Lake plume, which has focused on complete remediation of the contamination left behind from the Antrim Iron Company. Remediation here has primarily been led by the EPA. Second, we looked at the Wicks Manufacturing TCE plume, which is the largest TCE plume in the United States, contaminating an estimated 13 trillion gallons of groundwater. Management here has been led by Eagle and has focused on the use of institutional controls, where they have extended municipal water to residents with contaminated wells. Key successes were identified for this case study, including the experiences of local officials and residents indicating an overall confidence in management, with 8 out of 10 respondents considering the state's management a success, particularly in regards to the TCE plume. The perceived successes at these sites are due in large part to the extensive funding and local collaboration. Several challenges of management across these sites include efforts for the TCE plume have focused primarily on minimizing human exposure rather than remediation, and because of this, the TCE plume has continued to expand, which means that the community has effectively lost long-term access to the aquifer as a drinking water source. Due to the large percentage of seasonal residents in the area, there are additional management challenges in terms of water testing and public outreach. The Ottawa County case study focused on groundwater over withdrawal from glacial and bedrock aquifers, which has led to brine upwelling and declining water quality. Management here primarily relies on conservation and public education strategies at the county level. Several key successes we identified for this case study include the Office of Strategic Impact has taken a strong leadership role by directing initiatives, improving outreach and accountability. There have been strong interagency collaboration across the county and townships, including the creation of a groundwater technical advisory board that facilitates resource allocation, long-term planning, and public awareness. And finally, the county has created productive partnerships with institutions including Michigan State University, Michigan Geological Survey, and Hope College. In addition to these successes, several challenges of management include state regulations that restrict water reuse, incomplete hydrological data, and the inability of the water withdrawal assessment tool, as mentioned by Emma, to account for corresponding small-scale withdrawals in concentrated areas. A cited ongoing lack of public awareness and insufficient state and technical support make conservation more challenging. And lastly, the county's rapid population growth, as well as an increase in droughts, exacerbate aquifer depletion. The Washtenaw County case study focuses on the Gelman plume, which is a historical industrial pollution of 1,4-dioxane, and in contrast to the Antrim County case studies, this site does have a liable party. Management here has primarily relied on institutional controls and has been led by Eagle. Although recently the site has been added to the EPA's Superfund National Priorities list. Additionally, we examined management of a place called the Vela Pit, which is an ongoing mining operation that has resulted in the dewatering and contamination of nearby resident wells. Key successes we identified for this case study include strong local advocacy, which has held agencies accountable, regular meetings that have been hosted between officials and advocacy groups to improve information sharing, primarily in regards to the Gelman plume, and grassroots efforts that have increased visibility of groundwater risk and have pressured action. So across these sites, there are several major challenges of management, including that Michigan's laws and enforcements are insufficient to protect the resource and prevent violations. The Gelman plume and Vela pit continue to impact groundwater quality, and protection has relied heavily on grassroots pressure rather than protective state action. Okay, so we're going to move into the case study conclusions. So across all three of these case studies, we've identified several needs, and these include the state should increase funding and technical support to local entities managing groundwater challenges. Intentional, proactive public education is needed to strengthen groundwater management efforts. Remediation standards must be strengthened to prevent long-term contamination and protect future groundwater use. Michigan's water use program must account for cumulative impacts of small-scale withdrawals, and Michigan must eliminate zoning privileges for natural resource mining. And now I will turn it over to Paige.
Thank you, Kelsey. So, in addition to the case study interviews, for a policy analysis, we talked with 14 Michigan experts and 13 out-of-state experts. These included state-level regulators, consultants, geologists, legislative experts, academics, legal experts, and organizers. First, we looked at Michigan's current groundwater framework and examined relevant federal, regional, state, and local policies, both directly and indirectly as they apply to groundwater. Michigan's policies were identified through background research and interviews with groundwater experts, local officials, and residents affected by ongoing groundwater challenges in the state. While there are no explicit federal groundwater policies, there are some water protections at the national level that we found to indirectly apply to groundwater. And then zooming in, we found that the Great Lakes Compact was the primary regional groundwater policy in Michigan, as it sets goals that directly and indirectly impact groundwater. While the compact does ban diversions outside of the basin, groundwater remains vulnerable to large-scale users within the basin, and contamination is still not sufficiently addressed under the compact. As with the federal level, Michigan lacks specific and comprehensive groundwater policies, which creates a sort of patchwork of state and local policies that address groundwater use and contamination. There were several agricultural laws and zoning laws that we found to be impactful to groundwater protection at the state and local level, as well as several key local policies that have been especially impactful to communities in Michigan. Since the management of groundwater resources has fallen primarily under the jurisdiction of individual states, we conducted a policy analysis of 5 key case study states, being Arizona, California, Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Virginia, and the corresponding groundwater legislation that these 5 states have successfully been able to implement. The purpose of this evaluation was to learn from the successes of other states and identify applicable mechanisms for successful management that Michigan could use. Overall, we found that consistent strengths illustrated by these case study states were found to be comprehensive collection of statewide groundwater data and the development of large monitoring well networks, management practices that were able to adapt to changing groundwater conditions, annual status reports that readily were available to experts and the public, and then consistent lines of communication within regulatory agencies and across local government. And then results from our policy analysis are best visualized in this figure, where we can see that while there's clearly variability in groundwater management policies across the states that we evaluated, it's evident that Michigan's groundwater management has fallen behind in comparison to that of other states. And this result supports one of our primary findings that changes in groundwater management in Michigan's framework are necessary in order to meet increasing resource pressures. Now I will turn it over to Lillian for our recommendations.
Thank you, Paige. All right, so building on our research of Michigan's current groundwater stock and management system, Michigan's policies, and the policies from other states, we developed a three-part strategy that targets three main actors that inform groundwater management in Michigan. This includes the Michigan Legislature, EGLE, the Department of Environment, Great Lakes and Energy, and advocacy organizations that operate in this sphere. And rather than give you a glimpse of all of them, we'll talk about three main approaches in our recommendations. First, in a recommendation to the legislature, we propose a new Groundwater Protection Act. This is a package of bills that first advances the protection of groundwater quality by amending Part 201 of Michigan's Natural Resources and Environmental Protection Act to more strictly require the remediation of contaminated sites like those that Kelsey talked about. It also includes passing a statewide septic code to make Michigan the 50th state to implement one, and establishing a new fee for liable parties that apply an institutional control, which is a land or resource use restriction. And in this case, it would be for institutional controls that limit access to groundwater. The bill package also strengthens integrated management of the resource by creating a new groundwater coordinating council that brings together actors from across agencies that manage groundwater in some way, including EGLE, the Department of Agriculture and Rural Development, and the Department of Health and Human Services. The coordinating council would be specifically responsible for publishing an annual report like those that Paige just mentioned, that details the state of groundwater, ongoing projects and initiatives related to the resource, and proposes recommendations. And we suggest that the Water Use Advisory Council, which is already active, serve in an advisory role on this report. Also, to integrate management, we suggest amending parts 311 and 312 of the Natural Resources and Environmental Protection Act. And this would expand the jurisdiction of watershed councils and watershed alliances to include groundwater. And third, the Groundwater Protection Act empowers local decision-making by again expanding the purview of those watershed groups and also amending the Michigan Zoning Enabling Act to remove the privileges of natural resource mining in local land use decisions. A second multifaceted recommendation we propose is the Groundwater Protection Initiative. This initiative includes a ballot question for the approval of a $1 billion bond to directly fund groundwater protection, and the creation of a groundwater trust fund, which would insulate the bond funds. The trust fund would directly go to two associated projects. The first is an ongoing effort by Michigan Geological Survey, partnered with EGLE, to conduct comprehensive mapping of Michigan's groundwater. Actually, understanding the resource is critical to management at all levels, from the state level permitting process to long-term land use planning, as seen in Ottawa County. The second is a new local groundwater grant program. EGLE already offers a water infrastructure grant to local governments, and this bond fund would kickstart a new program for local projects that target pollution prevention, water conservation, and public education related to groundwater. In addition to these two packaged proposals, we have recommendations that more narrowly target the gaps our research identifies. For example, we recommend to EGLE and advocacy groups that they work with a coalition of actors such as MSU Extension, watershed councils, and professional organizations like the Michigan Municipal League to expand public education about groundwater. We also recommend that EGLE enhance its water withdrawal assessment process by conducting a comprehensive study of bedrock aquifer recharge and supply. This recommendation is meant to complement the existing work being done to update the water withdrawal assessment tool that Emma mentioned in the beginning, and will hopefully help to develop future parallel tools to the water withdrawal assessment tool that can examine the compounding effects of concentrated small-scale withdrawals, such as those causing problems in Ottawa County. Additionally, we recommend that advocacy organizations conduct research on possible future funding sources for groundwater protection. While the Groundwater Protection Initiative bond is a much needed upfront investment, it's not a sustainable funding source for the recurring costs like groundwater monitoring or the additional staffing needs that these programs may have. And to address this, we suggest that NGOs continue to examine additional financial opportunities. So I'm sure by this point you can see that our research is quite extensive, but we hope that it is just the groundwork for more commitment to Michigan's groundwater resource. At this point in our project, we are working through events and presentations like these, and by sharing our report to spread the word about our work. and Flow will continue to host the report and additional materials on their website. We hope that they can act both as a guide and reference for future work in protecting groundwater in Michigan. Before we move on to questions, we would like to just acknowledge that we had a lot of support during the span of this project. We are very grateful to the community members, local, county, state officials, regulators, advocates, lawyers, hydrologists, geologists, policy experts that chose to spend some time talking to us about their experience for the sake of protecting groundwater. Our advisory committee, which included 7 experts who read an early draft of our report, was an incredible resource as we refined our research and recommendations. We are also grateful to our client team here at Flow, Liz, Skip, and Dave, for lending their experience and guidance to this project, as well as our advisor, Mike Schreiberg, for being our mentor. And then finally, although you don't get to see their work, we're grateful for our peers in the water theme projects back at SEAS for supporting our work with feedback and inspiring us with their own projects. Thank you so much. You can scan this QR code and it'll take you to the Flow website where you can see the full version of our report. And I'll hand it back to Skip.
Thank you, Lillian. We have a few questions from the audience and encourage the audience to submit more questions. We have about 25 minutes to take questions and provide answers. So this might be Lillian, it might be Emma, it might be Paige. Any one of you can weigh in on this and supplement the answer if you so choose. To understand groundwater, where it is, its source, how much is available, which direction it flows, its mineral content, purity, et cetera, we need data. Can you talk about our data needs, how we would develop such data, and how the data would be used?
Yeah, so for groundwater data needs, Michigan Geological Survey is doing a lot to do some mapping of glacial aquifers and bedrock aquifers throughout the state. Right now, they're doing that Western Michigan water resource study. So I think once we have a better understanding of those values, it can really help improve the water withdrawal process so we can really understand how much water is being held in those aquifers and how much we can withdraw without causing an adverse resource impact.
Okay, one of the questions that we just received is, can we distinguish between groundwater and aquifers that is young, meaning recharged in the last 10 years, versus old or ancient, like glacial water? Emma, that might be you as well.
Sure. So, I mean, yeah, it's probably pretty difficult to tell how old the age of groundwater. I would say that glacial aquifers tend to be younger because they recharge more easily because of the shallow water table. But glacial aquifers can also be very old as well. Um, there are estimates of recharge. There's a public map available to see estimates of groundwater recharge, but groundwater Michigan, I would have to get back to you on the specifics of that.
Okay, thank you. Paige, we are surrounded by water. Does Michigan really need to be worried about running out of groundwater? And perhaps you can elaborate on the water quantity problem that we found to exist in Ottawa County, which
Yeah.
happens to be the fastest growing county in Michigan.
Exactly. Yeah, I think that when we think about Michigan, we think of it as a Great Lakes state, and we don't initially think about any issues regarding quantity. And we often think that that is just a challenge faced by our Western counterparts. But with changing precipitation variability, as well as increased withdrawals due to agriculture and household wells, as we see in Ottawa County, Michigan isn't safe from quantity issues, just like the rest of the country. And I think we can also see that through increased industrialization in the state of Michigan, groundwater withdrawals are going to become increasingly greater. And so there's going to be increased pressures on groundwater resources, and that pressure will not always be equitable to the rate of recharge. And so as population growth increases, industrialization increases, agriculture requires increased irrigation rather than just reliance on precipitation patterns, Michigan is going to increasingly face quantity issues just like the Western states are.
Thank you. Kelsey, Is there one recommendation in the report that you feel is particularly important, particularly critical, something that you're passionate about?
Well, I do think they're all particularly important and critical, but I do have a favorite, and that would be the amendments that we're proposing to the National and REPA to increase cleanup standards and establish an implementation fee. So basically, in Michigan, there are over 26,000 known contamination sites, and over half of them are orphaned, which, as I mentioned, means that they don't have a liable party. But that means that the other half do have a liable party, and it's important that we're holding those people accountable. For the orphaned sites, there's an estimated $13 billion in cost of cleanup, which will be passed on to citizens. And so we shouldn't extend that to um, continue to pass on costs for sites that have somebody that's responsible. So when looking at um, the cleanup standards, there's a consideration that involves like environmental, legal, and cost criteria, um, and that's assessed to the liable party. And so basically, we're proposing that the cost criteria be considered less than the environmental and legal. Um, and this was inspired by the Gelman plume in Ann Arbor, where the they found that what they were doing wasn't protective enough. Like they had these institutional controls, but the liable party was following existing state law uh, to clean it up. And the issue is that the state law like allowed them to do a cheaper option that didn't require them to remediate the aquifer. So essentially, the aquifer is continuing to expand under Ann Arbor and like um, moving towards the Huron River. So in some cases, it is not possible to institute a cleanup, and so in those instances, we would have a institutional control implementation fee that is passed on to the liable parties. Um, yeah, so I think that would be my favorite, just because it involves like holding the people accountable that are responsible and like taking that pressure off of Michigan citizens.
So a follow-up on this. We have, as you indicated, 26,000 sites of known contamination. We know that contaminated groundwater migrates with the flow of groundwater. So, what can homeowners who rely on household wells, um, how can they be assured that their water is safe?
Yeah, so I think that regular testing is important because groundwater homeowners' wells aren't regulated in the same way that public drinking water is regulated. So it is kind of up to the homeowners to complete testing.
Okay. The questions are starting to flow in here. What are some good ways to get involved and participate in advocacy for Michigan groundwater conservation and groundwater protection?
I think that's a great question. I think it depends on the community that you find yourself in. For example, in Ottawa County, there's a lot of like county and local government led public engagement initiatives. So definitely participating in those and getting the word out to your neighbors about why groundwater matters and why you're interested in it. But if there's not something like that, I think reaching out to a local organization or just a statewide organization like Flow to learn more about it and then start educating people. Something we found through the case study interviews we conducted is that in general, local officials and state officials have a sense that Michigan residents don't know much about where their water comes from. And so that's, although we didn't evaluate it specifically with like a statewide survey, that's kind of a major barrier to promoting better groundwater protection at the community level is making sure that people know what groundwater is and why it matters to them.
So, Lillian, what's a lesson from your research on groundwater that you hope to carry forward in your career? What inspired you?
So I'm kind of notorious in this group for not necessarily wanting to go into the water sector when I started this project, but I've been really inspired by the work that we've done. As I mentioned in my little intro, I'm also getting a master's in urban and regional planning, and I am now really interested in natural resource planning and community resilience at the community level that looks at how climate change will impact resource availability, like water systems. So I am really interested in the difference between regional planning in Michigan, and like we're proposing to expand Watershed Council and Watershed Alliance power over groundwater. This structure in regional water planning changes from state to state, and that's something that I'm more interested in exploring in Michigan and how we can make those regional plans stronger.
Very good. So this, I don't know who to direct this to, so I'm throwing it out to the group. Of your recommendations, which do you see as low-hanging fruit, ripe for implementation, and which may face more challenges as we move forward?
I could answer that. I think that so a couple of the recommendations that we made were incorporating groundwater into existing frameworks set out by a part of NREPA that includes watershed councils and watershed alliances. And I think that incorporating groundwater into those systems kind of just makes sense, and we might face less pushback. I think that when you're going up against industries that are polluting or that are like conducting um, mining operations, I think it's harder to fight against those industries because they have deep pockets. And so proposing things that may impact their bottom line, I think does pose a challenge.
Thanks. Here's a question. Given the escalating threats to our groundwater, why is there so little information or fighting back against Blue Triton's and Nestle's theft of up to 1 million gallons of water a day for a $250 a year, presumably meaning a permit fee? I will take this one in order to promote legislation that will be introduced in the Michigan legislature eminently, we hope in the next couple of weeks. It is the Michigan Water Trust Fund Act. It is modeled on the Natural Resource Trust Fund, which is highly revered and has been funding projects in Michigan to protect and conserve resources for a long period of time. The legislation would assure that water remains in the public domain. It would protect water from commodification, financialization, and privatization. And it would impose a 25-cent per gallon royalty for the use of public water for bottling water operations, raising $300 million a year that would be dedicated to support water infrastructure, which we desperately need, and which the Trump administration suggests that they plan on zeroing out in the future. So there is an acute need.
Can I add to that, Skip?
Pardon?
Can I
Yes.
add to that? I just wanted to
Absolutely.
mention that to tie in the report that we just published, we heard from many policy experts that we talked to. They really cautioned us about when we were exploring funding opportunities, commodifying water in Michigan, and it's something that a lot of policy experts are concerned about and cautious about. And so it makes, for example, like the legislation that you just mentioned, Skip, you have to get pretty creative about how you can imply the value of water without trying to sell it from the ground. And that was just something that came up a lot in our research.
Thank you. All right, what about impacts from oil and gas drilling, including fracking and brine disposal? Also related to brine, can you comment on road salt impacts to groundwater? I know you folks did some research in this area.
I might defer to Emma a little bit on brine contamination. We did hear early in our research when we were first planning this project about concerns about road salts. But the problem is that we couldn't nail it down in a case study sense because it's a statewide issue. Emma, do you want to talk a bit about the brine injection wells and how that came up in your contamination research?
Yeah, we did brine injection wells. We looked at lots of them, and we have a little bit of summary in the contamination section of the report, but we didn't do too much of a deep dive into those, so I'd have to look a little further into that to give you more information.
I can actually touch on that a little bit in terms of the road salts. So, um, as we mentioned in our report, road salts are the main driver of freshwater salinization, and we do use an average of 670 million pounds a year. So all of that eventually enters lakes, streams, and groundwater and can contaminate private wells.
Thank you. Here's a question. You may have answered it at least in part, but I think it's important. What are the team members' reflections on the role of federal legislation, regional coordination, or other types of policy mechanisms above, beyond in Michigan? For example, the Great Lakes Compact is the main regional backstop for withdrawals. Is it adequate? Could improvements benefit Michigan? I know you folks sort of did some analysis of the benefit of watershed planning. And so, what are your thoughts on this?
I could take this one. So in terms of the Great Lake Compact, so it primarily is diverting withdrawals outside of the basin. So, like as regions experience scarcity, it prevents them from being able to just like basically stick a straw in the Great Lakes. And it's been effective in doing that. However, in Michigan, it doesn't prevent pressures from large quantity withdrawals. In particular, like we have instituted tax breaks for data centers to come into the state. And so there's less regulation about use within the basin. And as Paige mentioned, it doesn't address any like contamination related issues. Does that fully answer the question, or do you want me to keep going?
That's helpful.
Okay.
So here's two questions. They're related. When a cleanup is done, how is the waste materials handled and what are the proper disposal practices? And what data does your study recommend for the state to require concerning the pollutants and chemical nature of contaminants in the water? Um, who would like to take that?
I suppose I can answer the first part of the question, which I think was about what happens to substances from contaminated sites. They're disposed of in like toxic landfills per state regulations. So that's overseen by whatever agency is removing substances. Skip, could you repeat the second question?
The second question is, what data does your study recommend for the state to require, presumably data development concerning the pollutants and chemical nature of the water or chemicals in the water, I suppose? So let me mention this. Flo worked with Michigan State University for 2 years on studying the use of institutional controls to prevent exposure to groundwater contamination instead of active cleanup. And one of the recommendations from that effort, that research effort, was to remove the contaminants that continue to potentially contaminate groundwater, to remove the source contamination, which isn't always done. Relying instead on institutional controls, restrictive covenants, or ordinances that prevent the use of groundwater. So one important recommendation was to actually do the cleanup of the source material to prevent further contamination of groundwater.
I can add to that second question that we don't make any specific recommendations about what kind of contamination data Michigan should be collecting that they don't already collect. One thing that came up in our interviews in Antrim County that wasn't widespread enough for us to publish in the report was changes in the way that Eagle had asked health departments to ship contamination samples to labs and like the timeline between when they were collected and when they could be evaluated. So there are some logistical hiccups, I think, in the system of collecting contamination data, but it wasn't a data gap that we identified through our research.
Here's one that I think your report answers. Could an institutional control public charge be used in part to fund the water trust?
Yes, we do talk about that. So Kelsey was talking earlier about the user fee for institutional controls, which is exactly this idea. And we actually recommend that Eagle look to the MSU and Flow report that created a calculator for what kind of fee should be implemented for institutional controls that should be used to calculate. And we recommend that the fee go towards paying back the Groundwater Protection Initiative bond. But in any case, it could also go towards a water trust fund if that bill were to pass and the fund was established. So yes, absolutely.
Okay. Regarding the Antrim County case studies, conversations, was the recent issue in Banks Township proposing to eliminate its zoning entirely something that was brought up under your review? More broadly, how did the smallest units of local government come up in your review?
That topic did not come up in our conversations. By smallest locals of government, I think you mean like villages, maybe. And so we talked to
Townships.
townships. Well, usually bigger than villages, but we spoke to a number of government officials in the village of Mansalona, and most of our local analysis came from the interviews we did in Antrim, Ottawa, and Washtenaw, where we talked to local officials at the city or township level about how they were handling issues.
Okay. Well, here's one that I know we've talked about. Has any of your research looked at the impact growth of hyperscale data centers and the effect they will have on groundwater?
Yes, there is a section of our report that talks about the potential for water intensive industry to affect groundwater withdrawals in the state. We take a look at current research, although it's still very young, about how much water data centers use. And also, Michigan currently has two different categories for data centers. One of them, depending on the amount of funding and some like kind of background economic variables, one of them is required to connect to municipal water supply. And as Emma's graph showed in the beginning, this is the second largest sector that withdraws groundwater in Michigan. So you could see the connection between the expansion of data centers in Michigan and a reliance on groundwater withdrawals. So while there's not a lot of specific data, especially Michigan in particular, it's an issue that we heard a lot about and investigated to the best of our ability.
Lillian, I can add to that as well. I think that one of the things that we found from our interviews with Virginia policy experts is how they're dealing with the increase in data center development in their state. And so that was a lesson that we were able to learn from them is how they're dealing with that growth of industry and how their regulations are addressing it.
And can you elaborate how in fact is Virginia addressing it?
They're tracking their monitoring well network very diligently, and they have collaborations with the USGS, which is one of the major strengths in their policy framework. And so they have been addressing it by increasing their modeling capacity of groundwater and tracking the changes that the implementation of these data centers have on the actual resources.
Paige, I think staying with you, I think the report indicates that nearly half of all wells in Michigan have experienced water declines due to pumping outpacing recharge over the last 3 or 4 decades. Does Michigan have a water quantity problem?
I think that Michigan will definitely have a water quantity problem. I think that right now what we're seeing is regional pockets of quantity issues. However, if we look forward and I guess um, see what the future issues will have, there will be increasing quantity issues. And I think that might be a little bit of a difficult truth to swallow for the state of Michigan. But I think that right now it's highly regional and it will become increasingly widespread.
Okay, well, with our close, because we're coming close to running out of time. A round robin for all of you. What was the most surprising finding that you made about groundwater policy while doing work on this report?
I think something that really surprised me to learn about Michigan groundwater policy was that groundwater withdrawals in Michigan are assessed based on surface water depletion. Learning about the WAT was really interesting to me because as Paige was sort of talking about in other states, a lot of them look at the balance between withdrawals and recharge to aquifers, whereas in Michigan we assess withdrawals based on how much stream flow depletion happens when you withdraw from a well. So that was something that I was really, really interested to learn about, and I found it surprising.
So when you say WAT, we mean the water withdrawal assessment tool that is in statute and used to evaluate the effect on surface water of large volume groundwater withdrawals. Anyone else on what was the most surprising finding that you found in doing your research?
I can go next. I didn't have a background in environmental science or hydrology when I started this project, and I was shocked to learn that we didn't actually know how much groundwater there was, and we didn't have a way to map it. That seems like the biggest data gap staring you in the face, and I'm really excited to see what Michigan's doing currently to address the data gap and what they can continue to do to get a sense of what water we have and how we can manage it.
In reviewing your report and the research that you've done, one surprising fact that I learned from your report and your research was the dramatic increase in high volume agricultural withdrawals that Michigan is experiencing, particularly in southwestern Michigan. And so we have to keep our eyes on that particular issue. Liz, I'm going to turn it back to you. Thank you, panelists. This was a wonderful discussion. Thank you for all your insights, all your answers to your questions. Liz?
Thank you, Skip. I do want to just have Kelsey and Paige jump in if you want to just any last thoughts you'd like to share.
I can go. I think that what I found most interesting about this whole process was coming from an out-of-state perspective and coming from the state of California where we're experiencing so many water quantity issues. It was really interesting to learn how that applied to what's happening in Michigan, and also it was interesting to learn about what's going on in our own backyard in Washtenaw County and the plumes that are occurring was really illuminating for me to learn.
Yeah, and I'll just add something I found really surprising was how much we rely on grassroots organizations to push to hold the state accountable and just like how problematic that is that people are having to like fight so hard for access to clean, safe water.
Thank you. Thank you, Skip. Thank you to all of our amazing panelists, Lillian Wegge, Kelsey Campana, Paige Lund, and Emma Walsh. It has just been a true joy to work with all of you for the last 16 months. And I also want to give a very special thank you to Professor Mike Schreiberg, who has been a fierce groundwater champion and partner in this project. And as you may know, this body of work really represents just countless hours of research and writing and analysis and provides an incredible roadmap for the next phase of our groundwater work here at Flow. As you have heard, we face a multitude of challenges to holistically protect every arc of the water cycle. But I have great hope because of remarkable students like these who understand the interdisciplinary nature of these wicked problems, who value collaboration, cooperation, and shared leadership. And I'm confident that these leaders of the future have the talent and wisdom to meet this moment. So immediately following our webinar, a link will pop up to a short survey. Please take a moment and fill it out. Your responses help us plan for future webinars and understand your most important Great Lakes issues. We will follow up with you next week with an email that includes recording of today's webinar and the SEAS groundwater report. Thank you so much for joining us today. Have a wonderful afternoon.